Hey everybody, welcome back to the 11th installment of Basic Training Family Edition. As you can plainly see, I have no hair. It's a long story, but as always, I would like to thank the Schellenberger Family Foundation and Recovery Bootcamp for their generosity and patronage, without whom this would not be possible at all. And let me just reiterate our goal. So our goal is to educate you and to provide you, as the same way we provide our clients here at Recovery Bootcamp, with a certain amount of preparation for their own recovery and prepare you for your own recovery as the family member of someone who's an addict. And we were inspired to help you become healthy in the midst of this like swirling, chaotic reality that is addiction. And it not only is it important and vital for you to be well informed and active in your own personal growth and spiritual recovery when it comes to someone who's active, a family member that's active in addiction, but also one that's transitioning into recovery while they are in recovery. And believe it or not, you as family members need to devote some time to your own continuum of mental health, even when that person is sober and in recovery for a long period of time. And in that vein, I wanted to give a shout out and some love to someone who I have in actuality been remiss in sharing gratitude for, and that's my wife. And she has put up with this and this alcoholic mind for over 20 years. And I have to say, Carolyn, I love you and thank you for having my back always, and understanding that I'm a little crazy and working on your own recovery so that you don't kill me in my sleep. I love you. All right. And as always, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague who is the COO here at Recovery Bootcamp, Dave Z. So I'd like to welcome Dave to handle all the logistical stuff that we talk about every week.
Give me 1 second.
1 second then, so I can babble.
We're going to get feedback if I don't wait.
Okay, so I'll give you a little idea. As you can see on the screen, we're at slide 112, which is the last slide that we finished last week. And we're going to just go over it again because it's the tail end of how we see the client progressing in their own recovery and what we can do as reflections of them, how we reflect or mirror their own growth and change in ourselves, right? And this is really important because the best thing that we can do, absolutely, to increase the chances of a loved one's long-term recovery, long-term sobriety, exponentially is by working on our own recovery path, right? And so that's what we look at. And so we're going to cover the end of this slide, which is basically how do we master those strategies to attain them for ourselves, for our own recovery, and then we model them back to the patient. And in doing that, it becomes a reciprocal kind of recovery for both the identified patient and ourselves. So we're going to do that in a second, and Dave's ready to come up now. So welcome Dave Zaif, my friend and colleague, and the COO.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I come up here, I know Mark's pretty easy to listen to, so I don't want to bother you guys with taking up too much of your time. But I do want to let you know that we're glad you're here. We're really going to start to get into the juicy stuff now with the family's role and all that kind of stuff. So that being said, I hope you guys have a notepad out, a pen, taking notes, downloading our handouts. If you go to our website, there's a link to watch all previous webinar sessions, as well as download all the handouts that we offer you guys. Also, we're going to be asking poll questions. I think there's 4 tonight.
5.
There's 5 tonight, so we're going to have a good deal of polling. For those of you that have been here before, you know the drill. They're all yes or no questions, super simple. Answers are anonymous. Answer them quickly. I can see in real time how many of you have answered in percentage. I usually keep the polls open for about a minute, and that way Mark can get back to his presentation and go over the results quicker. So when you see the polls pop up, just do your best to answer them. We also do a Q&A at the end of every session. So if you guys have questions, don't wait until the end. Start sending them to me at the beginning. There's a little question box on the right side of your screen or your mobile phone. Just go in there, type your question out, If it's logistics based, like techie stuff, then I can answer it for you right away. If it's a question for Mark, I'll do my best to have him answer as many questions live at the end of the webinar as possible. If for some reason we just run out of time and we don't get to your question, fear not. Mark will reply to you via email early on next week. Also, there's going to be a little chat box or a little like chat bubble type logo thingy turning into you. I feel like that's something you would say.
What,
little chat bubble type thingy.
Yeah, that's something.
So in there you can see that I'll be typing in some information. Our director of admissions, Nick Johnson, real sweetheart, nice guy, eager to help. If you know someone that needs help or you just have some questions about how this whole process works, he's a really good resource. I'll put his name, his phone number, his email address in the chat box if you guys do have questions. Some of you may have met him at our family weekend a couple weeks ago. I'll also put the links to the previous webinars as well as our handouts. I know we do have some assessments coming up.
Yes.
So it would behoove you to get those handouts downloaded and printed out for, a session maybe a week or two away.
Yeah, 3. Yeah.
Okay. So we're getting there. So I think that's all I got, guys. Again, any questions, please hit me with them. We want as many questions as possible just so our Q&A can be as robust as we would like. And that's it. Enjoy the webinar. Thank you, guys.
So it's good to see that my Luddite sensibilities are rubbing off on Dave. You can't see it, but I literally have Post-it notes like everywhere, like paper and all kinds of stuff. I'm a righty guy. But that being said, there was something else I was going to say, and I forgot. It had something to do with something else, and I can't remember. Some kind of thingy, apparently. So let's get right into it. Oh, I wanted to give you a rundown. So we're going to start. We're going to cover this slide 112, which is the end of last week's, and we're going to get into slide 113 from the start of this packet. And this packet is really about the family's journey. And we're going to move on from the family's journey, and we have about 3 solid more sections. And the next section is going to cover the phases of recovery like we just did for the addict, but for the family in their own recovery. At the end of the phases, we have a 10-slide protocol about enabling and specifically development of boundaries. We're going to give outlines. We're going to give projections on how to do them. And I'm even going to walk you through script writing of boundaries so that when you present them, you can do it in a structured way, because it's really easy for us to get off script, to get frustrated, to get flustered, to inject too much emotion in our conscious idea when we get into that kind of like almost semi-conflict state. And that's how we feel approaching it originally with our loved one who's an addict, whether they're active or even in recovery, because we've been operating in a single path so long that it's uncomfortable for us. So it's good to have a script. I do it a lot with the guys I work with in terms of their 9-step making amends, because even if I say the right words, my tonality and inflection can manipulate the conversation. And I'm an addict and an alcoholic, and I'm good at it, because I can look at you and say, I like you. Or I can look at you and say, I like you. And it's the same 3 words that mean something vastly different. So we're going to help you with that down the line. And then we're going to finally go back into the evaluations, which Dave mentioned. We gave them to you at the very, very beginning, so please download them and take them. Hopefully, you can even have take them regularly to see your progression in the knowledge and understanding you have of the disease and the way that you operate in terms of your relationship with the identified patient. So let's get back to slide 112. And basically, it's this idea of mastering these particular strategies, attaining them, internalizing them, and then in essence, inculcating yourself with them. Practice, 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 because then you become a model of that idea. And you model them to the patient, and then hopefully you model them to the rest of your family. In the same way that alcoholism and drug addiction is like the only mental illness that is osmotically contagious, positive change is also, and modeling is huge in interpersonal relationships. And there's really 2 main ones that we like to focus on. And we bring it also, this is the exact same thing that we tell the guys here at Recovery Bootcamp. Find people who are getting results, right? Study what they do, model what they do, and reflect what they do. Do the same thing they do. If you want something that someone has, you do what they did to get it, and then you attain it. And so we find people that are getting the results both in their Al-Anon lives as well as their addictive loved ones' lives, and they model those ideas and reflect them back and forth. And secondly, we have to do those things consistently in order to get consistent results. One of the biggest downfalls for both the family of the addict and the addict themselves is that a lot of times they do a substantive amount of work, they get a reward, something comes to them, their life changes, and they forget what they had to do to attain that. And it's a trap, because what we found consistently is you have to do the work. You have to do the do to get the get. However, you have to do to keep the get as well. You have to do what you did to get what you got in order to keep what you got in the long run. So you do the same thing consistently and you get consistent results. So let's move on. Did I go the wrong way? I might have. Nope, a family's journey. So we're going to talk about a family's journey on 113, and I think that we should probably start this out with a poll question. All right, and here's the question. If you're holding one end of a rope and someone picks up the other end and starts to pull, do you pull back? Boom. If I'm holding the end of the rope and Dave picks up the other end and starts to pull, do I pull back? Is that my default setting? Is it yours? That's the question.
We had a couple people having technical difficulties. Hopefully they can see in here. This one is neck and neck.
Neck and neck. Be honest. Think about your first reaction. Think about what you do. Try to envision the situation and literally what would be your first reaction?
All right, so we're going to close the polls.
Awesome.
Here we go.
52% say yes and 48% say no. It's great answers. Great answers. All right, so the majority of you said yes, and that is the single most common response to anybody. It's almost a no-brainer. If I'm holding a rope, you pull, I'm going to automatically pull back. So now let me read you something which is probably the most basic principle for all families and friends of alcoholics, and it's one of my all-time favorite quotes out of the Al-Anon book, which is How Al-Anon Works for Friends and Families of Alcoholics. And it says this: recognizing our options, alcoholics act and family members react. Most of the time we react because we don't realize that we actually have a choice. It's automatic. And in Al-Anon, we are reminded that we do, in fact, have choices. And just because an alcoholic gets drunk or high, acts out, fails to meet an obligation, right? Declares the sky is orange, misses an appointment, breaks a promise, we are not trapped. We have choices. It's as if we're holding one end of the rope and the alcoholic grabbed the other end and started to tug. We would tug back. It's almost automatic. It never occurs to us that we don't have to play. If we knew that we had options, we might choose to drop the rope, because there is no tug of war unless both parties hang on to their end. And by taking note of what the choices we are making now and what we do in reactions to alcoholics, we can begin to see the choices that we are unconsciously making. And then when we further examine it, we have discussion with other members of Al-Anon, we invoke the steps, and we bring the ideas and the sayings. We realize that we perhaps have other options, that we can even drop the rope. It's one of my favorite pieces. It's on page 30 in the book. So I just wanted to open with that. So let's get back to the thing. So parents and immediate family. This is the family's journey. And here's a little bit more background information. One alcoholic, one addict, affects a minimum of 5 to 7 people in their immediate circle. That includes doctors, co-workers, family, siblings, friends, everybody in their general initial, what we call inner circle, etc. And they affect these people in their daily lives, right? And nationally, if you add that up, that adds up to approximately 100 million people. And there's really 300 million people that are adults, voting age adults in this country, literally, which is roughly 1/3 of the entire adult population of the United States, right? That means pretty much 1 in every 3 people in one way are impacted and affected by this disease, by the disease of alcoholism and the disease of the sufferer. So let's move on. Parents and immediate family. So let's talk first about the parents. The parents, the addicted person, the IP, the identified patient, they set the tone of the entire family dynamic. I missed the poll question though, Dave, because the poll question I was going to ask is, as parents and as adults who are responsible, do you feel as though you are the ones who control the dynamic of your family? But since we missed the question, I can tell you the answer. It's no. I missed my post-it. The answer is no, because what in essence occurs is that they become the center of that micro universe. And people start to, without even knowing it, tailor and modulate their behavior to avoid conflict or enable, without knowing, under the premise of helping. But because the trauma radiates from that person and everyone's affected because of it, they start to focus their entire actions always through the lens of the identified patient, which in essence means that the patient becomes the center of attention and effort, and in turn controls the tone and tenor of the entire family dynamic. And what happens when they do that? Well, it displaces importance and intention that could go to other family members, to siblings, to brothers and sisters of the parents that may be ill. Things are diminished. All other crises that occur within the family pale in comparison to the central focal crisis that it sucks the energy and attention from the rest of the family member, and it tends to cause resentment and distance in other family members. What we also find is that these resentments develop, right? The home starts to become fractured. And one of the favorite things for an alcoholic or an addict to do to manipulate their family is to triangulate, to split other teams against each other. And when an addict gets into the position where he controls the family and separates the rest of the family into teams, he is in a true position of power. He manipulates them to fight, which takes the heat off of him and allows him to utilize the resentments between the family member to get what he wants, to trick people into enabling him. And in doing that, a lot of times, those archetypal roles that exist in the family are shuffled or reversed completely. So in essence, it destroys the standard flow of the family on a very, very intense, immediate level. What else happens? Well, for the immediate family, we find that addiction is systemic. We talked about this from day one. It is a systemic disease, and it affects the entire family system, because family systems are systems, and the disease is systemic, which means it has to spread through the entire family. And members of the unit become mentally ill solely by proximity and osmosis. Just being close to the person that suffers, you get tainted with that, because without knowing it, your conscious thought, your normal rational approach becomes tainted by the drama and trauma that is projected onto you, and you start making decisions that are inherently against your better judgment, making you yourself engage in a form of denial and sickness. Right? What we know absolutely is that the addict's chance of long-term recovery are proportional to the family's investment in their own mental healing. And that means not just vis-a-vis the addict, but as a unit separate from the addict. Healing those rifts that the addict caused solely by proximity, the resentments that occur within the family. This child doesn't get enough attention. I start to have beef with my wife. Things go on like this because we're always hyper-focused on a single individual. We have to bring the healing of the family unit. That system has to heal. And what occurs is that as I heal that system, it becomes directly proportional to the ability for my family member, that's the identified patient, to heal, because they can no longer work their psycho mojo to split us, right? We become unified. And even in families that have divorce or, where people are estranged, when it comes to this, they have to heal, because they have to heal enough to at least bring a unified front, which we'll talk about further down the line in terms of enabling and boundaries, to the table. Because unfortunately, the truth is this, that my mental health and stability is never as strong as someone else's sickness, unless I am unified with a group to overpower that sickness, to not let that sickness just get me, right? And we see this from Barthwell, which is the guy in American Society of Addiction Medicine, and he says, recovery chance is exponentially increased as more families address their own mental health issues stemming from prolonged exposure to the active disease of addiction. That's from the American Society of Addiction Medicine. And that's really the basic fact. So we have to start to understand that now we know the information. So what are the difficulties? What gets in the way of us as family members? Well, the basic difficulties for family. Oh, I skipped another question.
Do you have them on the slideshow?
No, I have them right here, but I didn't see it on the slideshow. Yeah, I skipped another question.
Can we use it too late?
Hold on, let me see. Let me go back. Yeah, it's too late. The question was, is there a single thing you can do to increase the chances of your loved one's long-term recovery? Absolutely. And what is that? Work on your own mental health issues. I'm sorry, I'm not up to snuff tonight. My dad used to say that all the time. So basic difficulties that are facing family members. The first one, and probably the most intense, is blame. And that blame shifts, not only directed at the identified patient, but in split families, we tend to blame the other members of the family, right? What we have to remember is that it is not the identified patient's fault that they're an addict. However, it is absolutely, unequivocally their obligation to recover. Absolutely their responsibility. And when we are in the blame game, both in the family and towards the addict, we tend to engage in our own forms of denial, right? How could our life be shattered? How could this happen to my family? And then the big one, what did I do wrong as a parent? I did my best. I didn't raise my child this way, right? That's a huge one. It creates a huge amount of guilt and shame in the family dynamic. And then finally, because we live in a society where we have friends as family members, we have relatives that are close, we have an expanded family, an expanded society, even in a small network, our own fellowship, as it were, we do tend to ask this: where does the denial come in, which is driven by shame? How does this look? What are people going to think? How are we going to keep up with the Jonesbergs, right, in the Jewish neighborhood? So we have to move on, and we have to talk about these things specifically, and we have to talk about them in terms of specific stigma, right? The stigma of addiction is what people will think. And we talked about this before at length. It is unfortunate that even though the disease of alcoholism and addiction was accepted by the National Institute on Health and the American Medical Association in the mid to late 40s, where it's been acceptably diagnosable through diagnostic criteria, has been in the diagnostic and statistical manual since its inception in the 60s, through all iterations of that book, it is still largely considered by the majority of the population to be an issue of will and choice. People do not understand the multifaceted nature of this disease. And that is why, in fact, we spent so many days talking about the disease model, talking about the community model, talking about the recovery model, the diagnostic criteria, and the disease that is addiction, right? And so what happens is when we worry about that because we're afraid of the stigma that we know even subconsciously exists because we may have had it before we were affected by this disease, we become ashamed of that addiction because we believe that it reflects poorly on our family values of how we raise our children, of how we exist in a family unit. Oddly enough, once the identified patient starts to recover, we see a strange kind of inverted trend. Although we are genuinely encouraged and happy by the progress of the identified patient, sometimes we can get a stigma of recovery, right? And it's really just still the shame of the disease, but in a really kind of in new clothes, right? Because we're afraid, in essence, that if we become public about our travels, our journey, and our personal recovery, as well as that of our identified patient, that it will in fact reveal that there was an addiction in the first place, and that that addiction was our fault, right? So this is really where the problem happens, right? So it's funny because we're shamed when it's occurring and they're active, and when they get sober, we can still harbor that shame. We don't want people to know, like, don't tell your boss at work, especially you see this a lot in family businesses where the identified patient goes back to work. Don't tell the other employees. We don't want them to think that, the people that run this business can't raise their children. It's insane, right? We have to understand that the healing, you don't see this in any other disease. People aren't ashamed that they've overcome cancer, that they're in remission. They scream it from the mountaintops. This is the only disease where we don't see that. And it's tragic. One of the next difficulties reflects on this idea of denial and shame. And what we talk about is the difference between guilt and shame, right? Because guilt is good for us, but shame is not, right? So let me ask another poll question because I missed the last two like a ding dong. So do you personally feel responsible for your loved one's addiction? Let's dig deep and answer this. Be honest. Do you believe that their addiction's your fault?
By the way, we have someone that logged on late.
Yep.
And asked a really important question.
Yes.
Why is Mark bald?
It's a long story.
She said she thought that you lost a bet.
I did not lose a bet. I found a strange, irregular color-shaped bump on my head, and I had to shave my head to see it, and I'm going to the dermatologist. I promise. It weirded me out a little bit. Yeah.
I thought you were just a trendsetter.
Or I'm fashion forward. You can't even see me.
You're about to. I'm closing the poll. It's another tight one.
I'm talking like they can see me. They can't see me.
Here we go. Here come the results.
All right, let's see them.
Strong turnout on this one.
Neck and neck, you think? Ooh, too close for comfort. Well, those of you that said no, I applaud you. And I give you all respect because I know that that's your first instinct. And I grant you a huge amount of kudos for not having it. Those of you that are still suffering under that delusion have to understand that the truth is given the systemic nature of the disease, the systemic nature of family systems, you did everything in your power and you did the best you could and it was good, right? And in the same way that the identified patient, it's not to blame for their addiction, but they are definitely responsible for their healing. The same goes for you, right? And it's because, oopsie, got to click. And it's because we have this perceived responsibility. If I could only have done this differently, if I could only go back. One of the most tragic events for people that are in this realm is, and I'm sure you've heard it, it's said all the time by normies, if I only knew then what I know now, things would be different. Well, that's called hindsight bias because the truth is you did not know then what you know now. And you could not, in fact, have known then what you know now because what you knew then was what you knew then. And you made the best intention, most informed decisions that you could at that time. And that's what happened. And remember that even the decisions we make, although they impact the results, there are far more variables that are included in every single event that happens than just our singular decisions, right? So we are not responsible for the addiction or for the identified patient. We are, however, responsible because that is shame-based, right? Because shame is about who I am, not about what I've done, right? And until you're informed about the disease is you. The broken family is you. But once you become informed about the disease and given the hope and opportunity and knowledge that there is recovery, you are not responsible for that, but you are, and you should not own that shame. However, you can have guilt, the feeling of, I do not like that environment. I do not like the results. I do not like the way this makes me feel. The actions are what I don't like, not the person. So now I become responsible for the recovery, both personal for the identified patient and for the family at large. Because I move from shame that I'm horrible to guilt. I've done bad things. Those things cause me crisis and stress. They diminish my self-identity and they cause me pain. I don't want to feel that pain. I don't do those things again, right? And sometimes we even feel guilt for forcing our loved ones into treatment through coercion. And we talked about this at length. It's very, very effective, right? In my personal opinion, which I don't share often, I talk about facts, but I'm going to tell you just from my own experience, having done quite a few interventions and being in this field for a long time, I do not inherently in my soul believe that there is such a thing as a failed intervention. I think that sometimes it takes longer for the seed to germinate and for the plant to grow. But once you plant that seed, it is inevitable that there is going to be a response from that effort, right? There is absolutely going to be a response. And so I think all interventions bear fruit. I just think sometimes it takes longer than others. And that's why we develop the ability to recognize enabling and set solid boundaries, because what in essence that does is it allows that tree to grow quicker. So let's move on to the next one. And let's talk about some of the basic difficulties facing these family members. Because, excuse me, as we have this journey, we understand the things we should do. We also have to understand the things that block us, right? And the first thing is that we tend to have shifts in perspective and commitment, which is normal and it's regular, right? And it should occur because as I learn something and I practice it and it becomes part of my routine, it becomes part of my process, it changes the way I perceive things. It changes how I feel. And this is where it gets tricky. When I first start a new process or a new behavior, it's difficult and it causes me to increase my commitment and the desire for that to happen. And as I start to become acclimated and habituated to that behavior, that positive proactive change, it feels as though my commitment wanes, like it's not as strong as it is anymore, which is very similar to the addict. They have the same thing, right? So what we have to focus on are the stages and the way our commitment changes. So very much like the addict, our first commitment to recovery as a family member is primarily situational. It's related to the crisis. We engage in a crisis intervention. It's focused on what is happening, and it gives us external commitment to desire to take the steps to recovery to get ourselves and our family member into it. We're having police problems and school problems and job problems, and these are all situational realities. And once we mitigate that initial crisis, we get our loved one out of harm's way into a safe place, we feel this sense of relief, which is good and you should. But what we have to do is we have to really start to work on ourselves, because even though our desire to control and fix the external situation is what brought us to this place, we need to shift to the internal commitment. The first commitment to change is driven by circumstance and situation. However, this internal commitment is different, right? Because once we get the focus off of the patient, we can start to look at the wreckage that has occurred just by exposure, and we have to change the commitment to internal, the desire to feel that revelation that the family needs to heal as well. We have to recognize that need in ourselves. We have to understand it, right? That we need to heal as well. And in that way is the way we start to develop boundaries. Boundaries are the things that allow us to not bleed our issues into the addict's issues and the addict's issues into ours. And I know I'm giving you a tease with boundaries now, but we are going to break this down in 2 weeks max, maybe 3. And it's going to be, you're really going to understand how to design, implement, and write a boundary and what it occurs for, and how it's going to help you heal, and by extension, help your identified patient heal, right? Our primary desire is to fix them, right? But we have to have the boundary, right? Because the boundary is simple. I am not willing to work harder at their recovery than they are. Initially, I am, because initially they are incapable of the recognition. So I'm going to get all my people together, and we are going to conspire to do an intervention and intervene through boundaries and situations and delineated red lines that we're not willing to cross, forcing that person into treatment through coercion. We absolutely have to do that. But once they're in there, I cannot, and if you remember, if you actually did the assessment at the beginning, the very first one is about expectations and how you project. Do you call your family member in recovery all the time? Do you doubt or really question the treatment professional's ability and the treatment program? Are you still trying to have your hands in controlling what's going on once they're out of your care, in essence, right? So what you're in essence doing is sacrificing your own self-work and the time you can spend healing yourself to still work at their recovery harder than they are. And that has to be a delineated boundary for you, because working harder for the identified patient initially than they are willing to work is actually the treatment professional's, did I skip? I did. It's the treatment professional's job initially. That's what it is. So let's jump quick to this idea of enabling. I'm just going to give you this graphic, and I don't know if you can read it that well, but we're going to try, right? So how do we enable them? We enable them by giving them money, right? They're going to beg, they're going to cry, they're going to say they're hungry, they're going to come up with every sob story, they're going to put like bandages on themselves and say they got hit by a car walking across the street. You would not believe the amount of BS that somebody can come up with to just get 20 bucks out of somebody. But understand that even if some of those things are true, I guarantee you that the majority of that money is going to go for them to get high. We do not give them money when we ask. When they enable, that's what we're doing. When we're enabling them by giving them money. That's how we enable them, right? We enable them by giving them money. How do we love them? We love them by giving them food, right? That we buy them something at a restaurant. We talk to them. What does it say here? Right? We connect and ask if they had enough to eat. We bring food to their house. We make sure that if they have children that they're fed for, right? We don't give them money because we know it's not going to go the right way. How do we enable them? We buy them a car or pay for their insurance. You know what? I can't work. I don't have my car. I wrecked my car. I just need another car. You got to help me. I can pull myself together. All these great stories. No. But what we do is we help them seek professional help, right? Because it has to be triage. We have to look at the primary problem. The primary problem is not that you wrecked your car and you can't get to work. The primary problem is you're an addict. That's why you wrecked your car and can't get to work, right? We don't pay for their phone because that's enabling. We don't pay for the minutes. Because you know what? They're just going to use it to hook up, and they're going to get their dope, and they're going to do what they're going to do, right? We don't pay for a phone. That's enabling. But what we do is we help them to get treatment. We help facilitate them getting treatment. We do those interventions as a group with that more power and bring them to a place of treatment, right? We don't provide them a place to live. We don't pay their rent so that they can spend the money they do make or hustle or steal on things that are going to cause them to lose it again. What we do is we answer the phone. And if they are seriously asking for help, we can then provide it. We can ask them how they're feeling, how they're doing. We are not going to allow ourselves to be browbeaten by some random nonsense. Oh, I've got this and that and whatever. No, when that starts, you say, listen, I want to know how you're doing. And you can call me anytime if you want help. I love you, and have some solid boundaries, but I am not going to listen to you try to manipulate me into giving you money or paying your phone bill or anything like that. And then probably the hardest one, we don't bail them out of jail, right? Because many people have lost their houses on this, right? You are not willing to risk your own safety to do something for them that they can absolutely do for themselves. That's the way it is. You don't bail them out of jail. They get busted on a dope charge, trust me, they're going to be out in 24, 48 hours unless it's the weekend, because they don't have room or money to house all these junkies in jail. That's just the way it is. Even guys that have DUIs that get arrested, they're going to get ROR most of the time. If it's a first or even a second offense, they're not going to go immediately to the penitentiary. They can get released and adjudicated and have a date set. Maybe kicking in jail is a good thing, But what we do is we understand this disease and we treat it like a disease. We try to break the stigma. We're not ashamed. And we understand the nature of the disease and we treat it as a disease. That's how we operate. And those are the difference between loving and enabling in a nutshell in this graphic. I hope you guys can read it. If it's big, you should be able.
Well, it's also one of the handouts. So I'm going to post the link to get the handouts.
Well, there you go.
So they can always download them or email me and I can email them to them.
Excellent. So this is a great handout. It's a good visual. It's like, are you helping them or are you killing them? So let's get into it a little bit before we get into the major one a week or so down the line.
Also, just keep in mind, Mark, we have a ton of questions tonight. So
okay,
we're gonna maybe stop in like 5 or 7 minutes to get some in.
Awesome.
Okay.
We can stop in 5 or 7 minutes because I think this is maybe our last slide or the next one in this section.
Okay.
Well, I think there's 1 or 2 in Family's Journey before we get into the phases.
So even if it's in a few minutes.
Okay, perfect. So what are the basic difficulties facing family members? Again, we did it. We talked about enabling. So let's look at enabling. All right. Let me click the enabling. Boom, it came up enabling. All right. So let's do a poll question. All right. All right. Is there a general rule, a standardized rule for you to recognize enabling behavior? Yes or no? Do you think there's one single standardized rule, or one statement that you can use as a guide? Or do you think that it's individual to the situation, right? Because situations are multifaceted. So maybe there's not one rule. Maybe it's a case-by-case kind of a deal. Because everyone's circumstance is slightly different.
All right.
All right, let's see them, Dave. Yes, good for you. 69%, the majority of you believe yes, and you are absolutely correct. Now, granted, there are specific circumstances and specific issues for every single circumstance in every situation because they are vastly different and the dynamics are different. However, there is in fact a rule of thumb when it comes to enabling, and it's pretty simple, and this is it. Enabling is doing for them what they can and in fact must do for themselves. It's just that simple. If the addict asks you to do something for them that you know they can do and you assume they have to do and you still do it, you're enabling. That's kind of a guarantee, right? And let's say that you have that really solid boundary, right? This there and you have that standard and you're not enabling, and they start doing the work themselves. There is a reflection on the addict side in their mind, and this is how it reflects. They're like, fine, no one's going to do for me what I can't do for myself, even though I'm going to fight and scream and, like, have a tantrum the whole way through, and I'm going to do it, God, begrudgingly as hell, but I'm going to do it. And now I start having some results, and my commitment shifts, right? I did it to keep the heat off, to get out of the gutter, to not have the police chase me. But now, even begrudgingly, I'm doing this work, and I'm starting to have different kind of things happen, results, feelings that I haven't had in a while. I'm starting to realize that, you know what? I like the results of what I've done. So I no longer try to do what I have to do to avoid what used to be. I do what I have to do to garner what may be, or what can be, or is what already is starting to be. And that causes a conflict, because if we draw the difference between enabling and love, and we start to help an addict who is actually working on their own recovery, that is really trying to do the right thing, that has got a job and working, but is making amends and is a few dollars short, or needs maybe some extra food, or a couple bucks to pay the rent because they're short, right? So it's okay to help someone that's helping themselves if they're trying their best. But on the addict end, what happens is I have spent so much time taking that I'm not so sure I know how to receive. In fact, I have a history of taking and taking and taking and taking at your expense and your expense and your expense and everybody's expense. And now I want to be a better man. I want to be a better person. I'm starting to have some of the rewards of recovery. I'm starting to gain some self-esteem, not in a theoretical manner, but because I'm doing esteemable acts for myself and those around me in my community. And it's one of the big things we do here at Recovery Boot Camp. We have them regulate each other. There's this entire thing where there's an esteem building because people help each other. And in doing so, they start to help themselves, right? So I'm starting to feel this way, and all of a sudden, somebody actually legitimately wants to give me a help because I've been working hard and I just can't quite, I'm just shy of the mark. And all of a sudden, I don't want that help. I start to feel resentful to myself because the feeling is I've taken for so long that I do not know how to receive with grace, right? Because in essence, they can feel guilty for offered help, right? Because a lot of times they feel, well, I really haven't done that much. It's not commensurate to what's being offered to me, right? There's a line on the very last page of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, in the basic text, page 164. It says, obviously, we cannot transmit something we haven't got. And we can't transmit any of what we've learned if we don't have a certain thing, right? Because transmission is giving. And you cannot give without a marker until you learn to receive with grace. And that's hard for us who are inherently thieves, stealers of time and money and effort and love. Taking so much, sometimes we have a problem receiving. And it's something that we work on a lot here. So let's see, we got one more slide and then we'll go to the thing. Dave?
Okay,
Sound good?
we have like almost 50 questions.
50 questions. So let's do this last one, because I think at the next we get into it. So here's the last one. Helping, right? You don't do what they can do for themselves. You help them do it by themselves. Their motivation and their commitment with resources that you have, not the ones that have been drained previously. And this is case by case. You do what you can in necessity to help them to do it, not to do it for them. And you develop boundaries. And you have to be careful when understanding the difference between boundaries and advice, because unsolicited advice is often seen as adversarial. It comes to me in the perception of being offensive nature at me, right? Whereas boundaries are more defensive because they protect the addict, the family from the addict, and the addict from themselves. And we're going to leave here on 125. I'm just going to leave you with a title. Boom. Phases of care. And this is the family. Remember, last week we covered the phases of care for the identified patient. Next week we start with the phases of care. And at the end of that block comes the deep work on enabling. I see enabling in 2 weeks. Absolutely. So let's move to the questions, Dave.
All right, so we're going to do the questions. We're going to make you full screen, because who doesn't want to see that?
Pretty much everyone, Dave.
So let's.
I'll lean in. I'll show you guys my melanoma if you want.
No,
No, let's not do that.
we want them to come back.
Yes, that would be good.
Okay.
You just dragged it. Awesome.
So,
Did you make it big for them?
just for you, so you can see yourself.
Oh, you didn't make it big for them?
Well, yes. Big
Oh,
for
good.
now too.
I don't need to see
Um,
myself. I'm already.
So let's get to it again. A ton of questions, so let's be thorough yet brief, if that is
Thorough yet brief.
even a possibility.
Mm.
So let's start with one that the person that sent it actually references it as a statement, but I think it might be something good to explore.
Posted.
She says that a statement regarding enabling, go with your gut. And that could get you into some trouble, could it not?
It could. All right. The lessons that you learn in recovery, in Al-Anon, in the family, addict's family, and in all these things, think of them as probiotics for your gut. You're training your gut to respond. Initially, go with your gut is good if you have trained that gut to have a certain habituation. On the other hand, you could go with your gut if you're going against what that gut says. If your first inclination is to feel bad and feel guilty and then enable them, then go with your gut conversely. However, if you start to feel like there's something shady here, yeah, there probably is. The best way to delineate that for yourself is to work your own program, get an Al-Anon sponsor, bounce those things off of him or her, train yourself for your bullshit meter to really get tuned, right? Like dial the squelch in on that so you can hear when it's like borderline sketchy and when it's like has veracity. That's important. So I think go with your gut is good and bad, but I think it's important to train that gut, because when you start to train yourself to respond to your instinct, right, then eventually you trust those instincts. But understand that those instincts can be convoluted being in an addictive cycle. So you want help to refine those instincts, to be able to differentiate between the ones that may be convoluted and the ones that are clear and autonomous. And in doing that, then you can develop the capacity to trust your instinct. So yeah, it's a hard question. It's a yes and no, and it is case by case. And train, do the work, learn the process, then utilize it. Bottom line.
Awesome.
Did that sound good?
Yes. Okay, so next question. How does a mom recover when the addict is the disappearing type? How can we let go of the not knowing if they are dead or alive? It is a never-ending grief process with no resolution.
Right. Well, it's brutal, because the thing that makes it the most brutal is they disappear. You're destroyed and torn. You start to work on yourself to draw a boundary for not allowing them to fracture your heart or suck out your serenity. You start to come to a place of stability, feeling some way, allowing it to be in the hands of the universe, or let the creator manage it. You start to get a little bit of stability, a little bit of serenity in the time when they're gone, and all of a sudden they reach out and it reminds you and draws you back. And as harsh as this sounds, sometimes the best boundary for the disappearer is to really disengage from them, right? Disengage from them. Because if they truly want help and are genuinely contrite and motivated to change and become okay, they will get word to you through other family members or something of that nature. It'll come back to you, because look, we got Facebook, Instagram, people talk. There's so many different avenues to get it into, but you need to, in fact, isolate yourself. And again, case by case, depending on the situation. But sometimes disengagement is such a strong proactive effect that if you make yourself unavailable for them to return, focus on your life, it can in fact change the way that the addict will come back to recovery or come to recovery. Because if they think that that final door is closed, they're going to have to find another one to open for themselves. And as harsh as that is, it's about you being healthy when they get ready to get sober. That's it. That's the key, because your work on yourself is going to propel them at a much faster rate in their own recovery. And I know it sounds harsh, but that's what tough love is. You have to love yourself as well.
Okay, so here comes one. It's kind of a two-parter.
Two-parter.
So this is from a mom who's saying, I'm trying not to feel guilty because her family is saying to her that you made your son and our nephew and, you made this kid, his addiction last a whole lot longer because you enabled him. And the entire family has had to deal with this, watching the money go away, his health deteriorate, his repetitive relapses, all his lies. And they're saying it's on her. They lost a lot of family members because of her refusing to put him in jail, so the family is mad at the mom. So she wants to know a way to sort of combat this or suggest a statement which doesn't sound like she's a victim yet, but is also not defensive. Okay. She wants to.
All right, so this is going to be short. You need to go to Al-Anon. You need to get a sponsor. You need to work steps, specifically a fourth and fifth step, so you can understand where you have been somewhat responsible for the circumstances because of your lack of knowledge of the disease or your ignorance in the dynamic. Once that happens, you start to move into 8 and 9 and actually fix that, make amends to your family, heal them, and by sharing with them that you understand that when I did not know, this is how I behaved. This is where my bad was. I don't want to live like that. I don't want to enable the addict to kill himself anymore, and I want to heal the family. I want to move from here now with the knowledge I have about my own affectedness from this disease, my own idea of healing, and how I want to heal the family, whether or not the identified patient is in that group. That's how you got to do it. You got to do it. You have to own what's yours, not what's not. And if you do own what's yours, you got to fix it. That's the bottom line. Because even though it wasn't your fault, it's your responsibility to get better. Same exact way.
Okay. Now, good, interesting question here. It says, I learned in one of my son's rehabs that enabling is only one of the family roles. I am not a classic enabler, but I discovered that I am probably the family hero. So how do I recover in Al-Anon or Nar-Anon when the steps and literature primarily focus on not enabling?
Okay. Well, the hero is inherently the fixer. The fixer is the opposite side of enabling. Both have the... excuse me.
As a rabbi, can you bless yourself?
I don't know. Bless me, and I can do that. So, I don't know. That was weird, but it probably worked. I could use all the blessings I could get. Yeah, it's a tough question. So there's actually a lot of different archetypal placements of the family. There's a hero, there's the mascot, there's the identified patient, there's the quiet one. There's all these different sections. And if you open up, excuse me again, wow. If you do even a little Google search on any kind of psychology related to family systems, you will see. Now, what they tend to be is doubles, right, or opposites of behavior. And again, any extreme is inherently an overcompensation for what's generally a centralized issue. But no one can be balanced because balance, oh my goodness, excuse me.
Bless you.
God. Balance implies an equanimity, right? An equitable reality. And personally, I know of nothing that is 50-50 in this entire universe, especially because You can have an idea of balance, but it's unattainable because circumstances require the proper proportionate response to that circumstance. So, but you can stay in a centralized location. So as the hero, you have to dial back the fixing. Now, you're the heroic type that puts the deep, deep boundaries. Maybe those boundaries are a tad too extreme also. There has to be movement. And initially what happens is that we have a pendulum swing, right? We're very, very anything you want, anything I can do to help you, to like, you're getting nothing because you've been hustling me for so many years. And it starts to go back and forth, hopefully not too much action on the extremes as it starts to become centralized. There's, and again, not balanced, but appropriate to the circumstance, appropriate measure to whatever dictate occurs in that situation. And basically dial it down. And granted, they say that Al-Anon's about enabling, but it's also about heroics, because they themselves are a form of like mild addiction pathology, the same way enabling is. It's a vicarious living through the identified patient. You still tend to be heavily invested in them, even in your reticence to do anything. It's still hyper-focused on them as opposed to hyper-focusing on yourself, which is what you need to do initially. And that's where the steps really come into play. The jargon and the slogans in Al-Anon are just that. It's a gigantic book, same in Nar-Anon as well. And there's steps, and those steps are about you understanding your own internal struggles and transcending them and coming to the place of self-forgiveness in 9, and then being able to share that and do it daily with other people in 10, 11, and 12. That's the beauty of this process. And we do need it just as bad as family members as we do as addicts.
Awesome. So it's 9 o'clock, but we're going to keep going. So just want everybody
Sounds good. We're keeping going. 9 o'clock.
I'm going to apologize to the several people that asked a similar question. I'm going to try and phrase it into one. So
Ooh.
And one of the most common questions we're getting is, it seems like some people have a pretty solid handle on what enabling looks like in active addiction, but they find it a little more difficult to identify when the addict is in recovery.
Correct.
And they're struggling with trust and when is it okay to help out with finances and things like that. And what does enabling look like in recovery?
Okay. Enabling in recovery looks like it did in active addiction, only it's vastly more subtle and the manipulations are vastly more sophisticated. And that's both on the side of the addict, because they learn, again, the jargon, the language, the psychobabble, how to present a certain way, how to look a certain way. And really, interestingly enough, that first question about the gut feeling, this is when you're actually working on enabling while the addict is active, and then they get into recovery and you start to have conferences with the treatment professionals, you're involved in family weekends or family education programs like this, you start to develop that gut feeling. And as you grow, you can start to trust that. You have to be careful of subtle manipulations. And many times, the addict themselves are unaware that they are manipulating. They think it's totally within the purview of their spiritual platform that they are on at the moment, and but it's not. So again, that same standard rule applies. If it is something they can do for themselves, they should. If they absolutely can't, you don't do it for them, but you help them to do it. You give them a leg up to do it themselves. And that's still kind of the basic rule. And you just have to become more sophisticated in its application in recovery because, like I said, the manipulations are far more subtle, right? And a lot of times they're not even malicious manipulations on the part of the addict. They're just, there's lingering entitlements and these kind of things. And trust is a tough one. So I'm just going to say this. Trust is the hardest thing to regain on both ends of the spectrum, but even more so for the family towards the addict themselves. And it takes time and consistent, protracted behavior on the part of the addict for you to slowly develop trust again and again and again. It is the single hardest thing to do. It takes the most effort on your part, and you have to be willing to risk having that trust violated in order to let it grow. But the boundaries now that you have made originally, you start to back them up slightly. And it's very interesting. So I had a boundary that was out front. Then I backed it up because my loved one's in recovery. So I'm willing to expose myself in trust, right? But I still have the boundary. I just moved it closer or further away from the addict himself. That means that if there's a violation, it won't come and boomerang back against me. It'll still get stuck on that boundary. So you want to keep creating your boundaries and keep them dynamic, not static, and bring them in and out depending on the growth and what's happening in any given situation. It's very complex. Sponsors are a great help. Therapists are a great help. Family therapists, dynamics, the treatment professionals. You can always call them and bounce that off of them. I mean, it's a good idea to have some really good help, right? Having a solid group of people, a core fellowship of people that understand what you're going through and going through it themselves. So yeah, it's a little bit more difficult. You need to hone your skills. You need to sharpen your ability. And you need to also be willing to risk, but you still need to have those boundaries in place so that risk doesn't backfire on you drastically and shut you down. Because it's not a smooth uphill climb. You go up, you fall, and then you drop a little bit, you drop a little bit, and that's the way the progression is. It's not going to be ice, right? So it's about risk versus reward. How do I make those boundaries? Risk versus reward. It's almost like it's an analysis almost on a weekly basis, which is why steps for the recovering family member is important, because you continue to do inventory, you're engaged in constant inventory, you're checking yourself, you're making sure you're okay. It's a thing, it's a way of life, and it's constantly changing and developing.
Great.
Sound about right?
Yeah, man.
All right,
Definitely. Good. Great. So I'm gonna lump together a couple other questions
Cool.
that are similarly
Lumpy
themed.
questions. I like lumpy
Yes.
questions.
So we have a couple people confused or just curious about when you were talking about intervention.
Yes.
If the addict is not ready, how could it possibly work? So one mom cites her own experience.
Sure.
Saying she's had her son has been in at least 4 rehabs, and the longest amount of time he stayed has been 2 weeks. So if he's not ready, how can an intervention work? Or
Well,
what's the benefit?
So first let me clarify what intervention is. There is what you classically see intervention, like on the show intervention, which is your group getting together, formulating a strong unified front to create a boundary and put this on the table, and this is where we're at. That's a seed that you plant. They know it's an option. They still want to run around and do what they do. But that's only one type of intervention. Every boundary you set, anytime you distance yourself from their nonsense, when you do not allow yourself to be a victim of their manipulations, is inherently a therapeutic intervention. And each one of those has its own result. And those results are cumulative until they feel so isolated and separated because they have realized they have burned every bridge, that they have lost. Hustle's just boom, 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 boom. I start losing hustle after hustle, and I'm down to like pathetic begging hustles. That those interventions become a cumulative overall intervention. And so they don't fail because it's a continuum as well. So I wasn't talking specifically about classic interventions, but that's the seed. They don't fail. They may fail in the moment, but they don't fail in the long run because, again, it's also like everything, it's a process. The steps are a process. Recovery is a process. The same way becoming an addict is a process. You may have the predisposition genetically or environmentally to get engaged in that, but you got to work at that the same way you got to work the other way. And the same is true for the other side of the equation, where it now becomes a process. Every single weight you can put on that's going to diminish their capacity to manipulate and utilize their tricks is not a failed intervention. It's an active intervention that's on the continuum of work towards the addict. And unfortunately, the child that's left after 2 weeks has never even gotten the chance to get past their post-acute withdrawal, never even gotten the chance to get past their anger for being stuck in there, probably the fuming and the raging. And those type of things, those interventions have to become more and more strict, right? The boundaries have to be stronger, more clearly delineated, and tougher for those interventions. Because if the low-grade intervention didn't quite work, then that means that you increase in that pathology, you increase in that continuum, you increase the severity of those interventions over time, right? Listen, it's the same way in medicine. You don't try the most evasive technique first. You start with the least evasive, hoping that it'll work without too much damage, and then you increase the evasiveness of the techniques. It's kind of the same thing, right? So if you look at them as a cumulative process, I think you could, you know, look, and this may sound horrible and tragic, but they all work. They all do, because there's an expression, right? And I'm an addict and alcoholic, right? So I was going to stop drinking and getting high eventually. It's just better if I'm alive for that. That's the bottom line.
Okay, so we're going to ask one more question and then wrap it up. And as a side note,
a
lot of people are sending their prayers to you. They're hoping it's not melanoma.
I don't think it's, I don't know. We'll see. If it is, he'll burn it off or whatever, you know.
But we have a lot of people that are saying you're in their prayers.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, because it would look weird for me to be at Dave's wedding with like a giant Band-Aid on the side of my head. Bizarro.
Okay, so let's ask this question.
Mazel tov to Dave, by the way.
This question is about love. And who doesn't like a question about love? Am I right?
Oh, God. Now, are we talking about neurological love, download of phenylethylamine in the brain that creates limerence, or are we talking about?
No, I mean, we could maybe even share our own. I mean, it's pretty broad. It says the person is asking your opinion.
Sure.
If a parent's love makes a difference in the addict's wanting to recover, does it ultimately make a difference? And it may be, you know, one take in active addiction and a different take in recovery.
Yeah.
But does the love of the parent?
I would say it absolutely does. I would say that love is a healing force. It is the counterbalance to fear, right? The opposite of love is fear, right? Fear comes, creates the unknown paradigm of frustration and anger, which then turns into hate. Most people think hate's the opposite of love. It's fear. Fear is the antidote to love, and love is the antidote to fear. So, of course, for the addict, the fear of the unknown of what is, right? That's how that moment of change in the addict's mind is when the discomfort that they feel in the moment of their misery becomes worse than their fear of what they don't know that can be. So increase in love is always going to overcome and diminish the fear. And again, it's a beautiful sentiment. But you have to understand as well that there are multifaceted manifestations of love. And whoever asked this question is absolutely right. It's different in active addiction than it is in recovery. And it's always changing, because as interpersonal relationships develop and people mature and become more intimate, right, which means that they lose the facade of lies and delusion and denial into intimacy, into me you see. It's crazy, but it is. I'm transparent. I'm willing to risk that pain to allow you to see something, and hopefully you're the same. Do the same for me. It encourages those risks and those rewards. Love is always the paradigm of recovery from day one till the end. It's going to be, and that's what it's all about. Is it quantifiable? No. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure it is empirically, from your own experience, from your own opinion, but not in terms of like some kind of gradation or scale. But yeah, love is love. You just have to, the appropriate love, excuse me, again, the appropriate love has to be appropriate to the circumstance, right? Appropriate to the circumstance, because opening and risking yourself can also leave you open to manipulation. That's the way it is. Yeah, I think love is huge. Yeah.
I think
it makes a huge difference in recovery, right? And even if that love means that you're going to distance yourself from somebody that's using, and in essence cut yourself off, it's still love, right? It's love of self, love of them. Yeah, it's huge. Whoever asked that question is awesome. Love more, love all the time. You know, hate to quote the Beatles, but you know the song. Yeah.
I think that'll be what we end on.
Awesome.
For the evening. If we didn't get to your question, Mark will follow up. Also, we didn't get last week's webinar up this week.
Okay.
So we will have last week's webinar as well as tonight's up. Hopefully tomorrow, at worst case over the weekend. And that's it. I just posted also a little chat with the handouts. It's going to become more and more time sensitive, I guess, to print out those assessments and just go over them, or just have that handout on enabling as well. And I think that's
it. And let's thank again Recovery Boot Camp, Schnellenberger Family Foundation, the coach, and Beverly, who have been instrumental in making this all happen, allowing us to give our love to you. And in turn, hopefully you give it to us. We love you all, and we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you guys. See you next week.